Welcome to Talk+Water, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of water with those making waves. My name is Todd Votteler, and I'm your host for Talk+Water. I'm also the principal of Collaborative Water Resolution, which you can find at weather.Drawing. In addition, I'm editor-in-chief of Texas+Water and the Texas+Water Journal. Both publications are free. My guest today is Jeremy Mazur. Jeremy is a senior policy advisor for Texas 2036, a nonprofit think tank. Jeremy directs Texas 2036's work in natural resources, which includes energy and water. Drawing on over 20 years of experience working with the Texas legislature and state agencies like the Water Development Board, Jeremy works directly now with state and legislative leaders on policy changes needed for Texas' future energy and water needs. Jeremy, welcome and thank you for being part of Talk+Water.
Todd, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for this opportunity.
So I always like to start out and kind of ask people, what got you interested in water or what made you think, water is a great kind of, focus for my career?
Well, I started quite accidentally in water 2 decades ago in 2003. Back then, I was the chief of staff for State Representative Bill Callegari. And Chairman Callegari's interest was always in water. And he was active in the water industry in the Houston area, in Texas. He ran a water utility called Amtex. And he was a big deal and still is a big deal in Texas's water world. So when I started working for Chairman Callegari in 2003, he wanted to be a part of the House Natural Resources Committee, which you and I both know is the House's leading committee with jurisdiction over our state's water resources. Now, at the time, I thought natural resources was just some sort of big environmental thing. I just didn't, as a young Republican staffer, I didn't know any better. But over the course of 5 to 6 months of staffing Chairman Callegari on that committee and having the honor of working with him for nearly a decade, I learned a lot about water. And it took me a decade, I think, to get caught up to speed on what the critical issues were and what direction our state needed to go. But it all goes back to 2003 when I was working for Chairman Callegari. And as some listeners here may know, he was quite active in water legislation in the Texas House. He worked on legislation regarding interbasin transfers and junior rights. He worked on legislation governing special districts, including municipal utility districts. He also had some groundbreaking legislation in 2005, I believe, regarding certificates of convenience and necessity for water and wastewater utilities. And so while working with Chairman Callegari over that decade, I not only met plenty of wonderful people like yourself in the water industry, but I developed a keen appreciation for the issues affecting Texas water sector and also some ideas with regard to what we could be doing with regard to our water resources. So I worked for Chairman Callegari for a wonderful decade, and I couldn't say enough wonderful things about that man, and I still will throughout this podcast. But I went from there to the Water Development Board in 2013, where I had the distinction of serving as their Director of Governmental Relations for that year. And then from there, I transitioned back to the legislature. I went to the Senate, where I worked for a senator out of Collin County, Senator Van Taylor, where I was his deputy chief of staff and legislative director. And Senator Taylor at that time has significant interest in water issues. I mean, Collin County is where the North Texas Municipal Water District is.
Right.
Matters of water supply and water availability and utility development are critical to the development of Collin County. And so we did a lot of work in Senator Taylor's office on water issues. And after a great career there, he went off to Congress, and I went to another water agency known as the Railroad Commission of Texas. For the uninitiated, the Railroad Commission has nothing to do with...
Everybody always has to say that. So
I did not get a choo-choo conductor's hat. I was their Director of Government Relations for the state's leading energy regulator. But what's so profoundly interesting about the Railroad Commission and its rules and its oversight is a significant level of focus on protecting our state's groundwater resources. there is so much attention paid to orphan wells, abandoned wells, making sure that wells are in compliance with our statewide rules that are protective of underground drinking water quality. The Railroad Commission, in addition to providing stewardship for our state's energy sector, plays a critical role with regard to the protection of our underground groundwater resources. And so you could say when I was Director of Government Relations at the Railroad Commission, my work and my career in water was certainly furthered during that time. And and I have to say the commission was a wonderful place to work. Under the direction of the three commissioners and Executive Director Wei Wang, it was a profoundly professional organization and well-run agency to serve, and it was an honor to be there. So I was at the Railroad Commission up until September of 2021 when I finally came over to be a senior policy advisor at Texas 2036.
You have one of the most well-rounded backgrounds in kind of, state government at the higher levels, than probably anybody I know. I was just thinking about this. I mean, so Chairman Callegari, what I remember when he was chairman, you were working for him, he was really not afraid to tackle difficult water issues. I mean, I remember there was a lot of, really, in the weeds and detailed discussion about some of these water problems that, we're still dealing with today that are just really tough to solve.
Yeah, Chairman Callegari and I had a wonderful relationship working together because he had a very keen sense of attention to detail. He really wanted to dive into issues and learn more what was driving the issue and what were some solutions that could work. Looking back, I would credit his discipline to the fact of the matter that he's a professional engineer, and when you put a professional engineer on the job, you're going to get an approach and an approach to policy issues like that.
So. And you were then on the Senate side. So how you can kind of compare those two? You'd been working on the House side, then you're working on the Senate side, and kind of seeing what's going on with water. Each side of the legislature. What was your impression about the Senate and how it approached water?
It was, I think, in the House, a lot of the focus was on, what is the Natural Resources Committee doing? What are the big issues that they're looking and that they're passing? And the House, of course, has an incredible amount of deference to what members have to say is important in their district. On the Senate side, I think, again, the Senate takes its cues from what the Senate Ag, Rural Affairs, and Water Committee instructs. And so I think both chambers are certainly consistent in that regard. What surprised me when I moved from the House to the Senate was things weren't entirely that different. There were certainly different players and different politics in each chamber, but I think both chambers certainly listened closely to what the members and leaders of those respective committees of jurisdiction had to say about water.
So you just mentioned something that I always found interesting. So in the Senate, natural resources used to handle water, and then the Water, Agriculture, and Rural Affairs Committee was created, and then water went over to it.
Yes, that's right. And that happened in 2015 when Lieutenant Governor Patrick became Lieutenant Governor. Before 2015, water issues in the Senate were under the jurisdiction of the Senate Natural Resources Committee. But what happened in 2015 with the change in the Senate rules was you still had Senate Natural Resources that largely had jurisdiction over the state's energy resources, but water resources were split off into a new committee, the Senate Water, Agricultural, and Rural Affairs Committee, which was chaired then and is now by Senator Perry from Lubbock.
And he was a freshman senator when he was made chairman.
Yeah, that's right. There was a big incoming freshman class in 2015, and Senator Perry was one of those members.
So now you're at Texas 2036. So tell us about Texas 2036.
So Texas 2036, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan, data-driven policy think tank. What fascinates me about Texas 2036 and what drew me to this organization is our North Star goal to make Texas the best place to live and work by 2036. And we're working in several core areas in our organization. I mean, they include energy and natural resources, as we'll certainly talk about the water side in the coming hour. But there's other significant focuses of this organization, including public education, workforce, healthcare, transportation, and even broadband. And I would point to our organization's success during the last session in passing some big time broadband reforms for our state.
And there, right now, one of the things you're focusing on is water, of course.
Yeah.
And we're here to talk about water. So tell us about some of the projects at Texas 2036 that are water related that you're working on, or you're directing, I guess.
So I hit the ground running when I joined Texas 2036 in 2021. Shortly after joining, we released a report where we had partnered with the Office of the State Climatologist on extreme weather trends, not only historic trends, but the trends that we can expect over the next 15 years between now and 2036. That report from the state climatologist was rather alarming. It pointed towards we can expect an increase in the average temperature. We can expect greater drought severity. And paradoxically, we can anticipate greater rainfall intensity that can contribute to a higher likelihood of urban flooding. There's this famous quote that no doubt you and I have heard, that Texas is the land of perpetual drought, visited occasionally by the biblical flood.
Right.
That report validated that finding from the National Weather Service from 1922. And so we released that report, and we talked a lot about the findings of that report. And our big recommendation on the basis of that report was we're not looking at what's causing these changes in extreme weather. Our argument is that if the data points to future droughts being severe, if the data points to future floods being more intensive, then we need to scale our state's natural resources infrastructure, specifically our water supply and flood control mitigation infrastructure, to be responsive to these growing extremes. So that was one of the first projects that I worked on with when I started with Texas 2036. There's another project that we started just about a year ago. I think it's almost a 1-year anniversary, where we wanted to look at, and this is still ongoing, we want to look at water markets in Texas. And I hope we'll talk about this more later in the hour. But I have, based on my 2 decades of water experience, I think our water policy is a little bit in a rut. And we have lots of conversation about financing water and wastewater infrastructure. That's a conversation that needs to happen. We have a lot of conversation about the existing regulatory regimes for surface and groundwater, which is good. We need to have that conversation. But what's really missing from the policy discussion is how can we encourage the voluntary transfers of water? I think when we look at the fact that we're a drought-prone state, we can expect future water scarcity due to drought, as well as consumption and sedimentation of our reservoirs and depletion of our aquifers. Water is going to be more scarce in the future. And I think one of the more effective ways to manage our water is to introduce market mechanisms to the water sector. So that's the second project that we're working on, Todd, an evaluation of water markets. Now, the third thing, which is a big issue for this session, has to do with our aging, deteriorating water and wastewater infrastructure. To rewind a bit here, in late 2021, Congress passed what was known as the U.S. Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. That act provides Texas upwards of $2.5 billion over the next 5 years for our state's clean and drinking water state revolving funds. And this is good. IIJA course corrects decades of declining federal investment in state water and wastewater infrastructure. So shortly after IIJA was passed, Texas 2036 partnered with a couple other organizations, including the Texas+Water Foundation and the Water Finance Exchange, to host a series of stakeholder meetings to talk about the IIJA and what the opportunities were for Texas in implementing this bill, what could be some strategies for implementing IIJA, and also more broadly, what types of problems could be solved using IIJA dollars. And so we hosted a series of stakeholder meetings throughout 2022 to talk about IIJA and other infrastructure issues in Texas. And what came out of that was a blueprint that was developed by myself at Texas 2036 that is aimed at this current legislature for the 88th legislative session. That comes up and includes several recommendations, some of them very ambitious, aimed at not only what we need to do in order to implement IIJA, but also as a matter of policy, what we need to do to address the bigger issue of aging, deteriorating, and failing water and wastewater infrastructure systems in our state.
So I have an episode of Talk+Water where I interviewed the comptroller, Glenn Hager. And of course, he said, which everybody knows now, that, we got this record amount of money for this session. The legislature has to spend and figure out what its priorities are. And also, I can say this, even though it hadn't been published yet, as we record, that, I've got a commentary from Chairman Perry about the session, talking about water infrastructure. And so it seems like, we're kind of at the, it's the ideal time to maybe get some more money for infrastructure. I mean, people are thinking about it and the state's got money. And so does it seem like there's a lot of interest?
I think there's a significant amount of interest when the issue of water and water infrastructure comes up with this legislature. I have a running joke that if you ever want to appear as the smart policy person in a room, just be quiet for a second and mention, the most important thing to Texas is water. And then people will start listening to you. But we have a historic budget surplus this session. It's $32.5 billion. And there are spending limitations with regard to how much of that the legislature can spend this session, because there's a constitutional and a statutory spending cap. But legislators are looking at options of what can they do to wisely invest some of the surplus. And we're seeing a significant amount of discussion about where it can go. I mean, some want to send it to property tax reform. Others want to buttress the state's rainy day fund or save it for worse economic days that, we hope never visit Texas. There's also education reforms. But another type of investment that is being discussed and was even mentioned by Governor Abbott during his inauguration on Tuesday was investment in infrastructure, including water infrastructure. And Texas 2036 has an idea on what to do. And as I said, we had these stakeholder meetings and we have a blueprint focused on fixing our aging, deteriorating water and wastewater infrastructure. So we think, in the world of water, there's three big options in front of us. One, we can capitalize a fund or repurpose an existing fund and capitalize that to focus on the issue of aging, deteriorating water and wastewater systems.
Is this a water fund or some other fund that you?
So it would be a water fund.
Okay.
This is what I have described in our blueprint. The second option would be to put more money aside, perhaps in the State Water Implementation Fund for Texas, or SWIFT, that was approved by voters in 2013, to finance more water supply projects, more reservoirs or desal projects, or water reuse. Or lastly, can there be more funding for flood control and mitigation members? Put more money in the FIF that was created by Speaker Phelan in 2019. I think all three of these ideas and proposals have merit. And at the end of the day, I think Texas 2036, we recognize that our flood infrastructure needs are significant. So yes, we have to invest in flood. We are going to need more water supply. So yes, we need to invest in more water supply development. But we also think we should be paying a little bit closer attention at the issue of our aging and deteriorating water and wastewater infrastructure. In December, I wrote an article on the Texas 2036 blog about the top 10 water headlines of 2022. And several of those major headlines from 2022 had to do with systemic failures due to aging, deteriorating infrastructure. There was the 25-year-old trunk line that broke in Odessa in June, leaving the city without water for 48 hours.
Right.
I mean, can you imagine being in Odessa without running water for 48 hours in June?
I have a hard time imagining being in Odessa for 48 hours. I'm just kidding. I used to work for a judge out there, so
okay,
I'm just teasing.
But imagine being there without running water.
Right, it'd be tough.
It's I think it would, if you looked it up in the dictionary, it would say not fun.
Right.
And then, in addition to Odessa, the city of Laredo had significant levels of water loss in their system that decreased the line pressure. And the city had to boil water for 13 days, which is a profound inconvenience for families and businesses in that community. And then there was a catastrophic shutdown in Zavala in East Texas. And throughout 2022, we saw other cities that were dealing with the consequences of their aging and deteriorating infrastructure. And the families and businesses living there had to endure this in the form of boil water notices where they had to boil water, or in some cases, there was just no water coming out of their tap. And so when you look at the top 10 headlines of 2022, a lot of it had to do with a lot of those headlines were a result of our aging, deteriorating water and wastewater infrastructure.
Yeah, our infrastructure is overdue in a lot of places for upgrading and expansion, and we're also having kind of a hard time keeping people, running those facilities too. It's there's so many other opportunities. It seems like that those folks get poached.
And I think that's part of the mounting storm of crisis that is coming for Texas water infrastructure. And what we saw in Odessa, in Laredo, and even in Austin and in Houston and other cities last year and this year are evidence of this mounting storm coming for Texas water sector. And what we propose in our blueprint, the Texas 2036 Water Infrastructure Blueprint, is when we look back at this, when we look at this surplus, this $32.5 billion historic surplus, this represents an opportunity to contribute, to establish a new fund oriented towards addressing these aging and deteriorating water systems. But I think the issue is not just putting aside more money and spending it on systems. There's several other things that we need to pay attention to. First, we need to have a bigger conversation on the policy level about technical assistance. And this is the outreach that can be provided by the board or third-party providers like Texas Rural Water Association, Communities Unlimited, or the Water Finance Exchange, to go to communities, to work with them, and to develop solutions to fix their problems with their water systems. We have over 10,000 public water systems and wastewater operators in our state. And we just need, and a lot of these utilities have problems. The bigger our technical assistance core in our outreach, the better we can start tailoring solutions to help these communities. In addition to technical assistance, I think we need to have, as a matter of policy, a new conversation about regionalization and regional solutions.
Did you see me writing that down here?
No, I didn't. I don't even have my glasses on.
Regionalization. I want to talk about that next.
I put my glasses on. I see it. So that's one of the things, 20 years ago when I started working in the legislature, not only did I have hair, I didn't have to use glasses. But here we are. Regionalization. And there's when you read the Texas Water Code, the different chapters in the Water Code, you will find that the legislature has put in there time and time again the word regionalization. And clearly the legislature has articulated a preference for the efficiencies that can be gained and accrued through regionalization. And we generally know what they are. You get better workforce utilization, more efficient rate base, more efficient use of source water and regional water management. There are a host of benefits associated with regionalization that you and I could easily spend an hour talking about. But even though, regionalization is prioritized time and time again by the legislature and the water code, we still have 10,000 water utilities across the state. And I'd like to borrow this line from this doctor from University of Wisconsin, Manny Teodoro, who said that our water sector probably needs to shrink to grow. I couldn't agree more. I think we need to have a renewed focus on regionalization. And if we're going to create this new fund to address failing or at risk of failing water infrastructure, we need to have regionalization as part of that discussion.
I totally agree with you. I think, like you say, you look at the water code and it does encourage it, but, why are people not doing it? And so I think they need to have some incentives. And, financial incentives would really be helpful, I think, because, a small little utility, you have little mom and pop utilities in the, 10,000 utilities. I think you're talking about mud suds and river authorities and, groundwater districts and, the whole shooting match.
Or the alphabet soup of Texas water.
Right.
You've got mud, suds, WCIDs, freshwater supply.
Yep. And the little ones, but you think about it, the little ones are really not going to have the capability or experience to be able to sit down and apply for some of the grants that are available or funding from the state. And, regionalization, makes sense in that regard, coming together for, different utilities in a region that can help each other out and work together and apply for money together.
And that's where technical assistance comes in, Todd, because I've had some great conversations with Hank Havoc at the Water Finance Exchange, and also Carlos Rubenstein, formerly chairman of the Water Development Board. He's also a Texas Commission on Environmental Quality commissioner. Technical assistance outreach can work with these small communities that have fallen through the cracks, that don't have the resources like you're talking about. To not only design solutions responsive to their local water needs, but also to work with communities to develop these regional solutions. I think the conversation we need to have about technical assistance and regionalization are closely aligned. And so when you look at the Texas 2036 blueprint, you'll find there's a significant focus on these two elements.
And Carlos, as a matter of fact, I mentioned as a former guest on Talk+Water. So the blueprint, where can people find it? Can anybody get a hold of it and see what you've got in mind?
Yes, we're putting it up. We put it up online this week, the week of January 13th that we're recording. And so you can find it at Texas 2036. That's Texas spelled out 2036.org.
And before we move on to water markets, talk about them a little bit, are there any other water-related issues that Texas 2036 has been working on?
Well, our big focus this session, our big push is going to be on this blueprint. And there's one more element of this blueprint that I want to describe. So if we create this new fund, we put $5 billion in the fund, and also we'll talk about setting up revenue streams such as a sales or severance tax revenue stream for this fund that could be used to finance projects in the future and to support the Water Development Board's operations. If we create a new fund, we need to have some guidance with regard to how the board would administer this fund. And one of the key elements that I have included in this blueprint is that we need to start having a statewide assessment of water and wastewater utilities to identify those that are either failing or at risk of failing using certain criteria. And this would be a data-driven approach that we're proposing in our blueprint, where you can look at certain items such as what the rate structure is, the financial, managerial, and technical capacity of a utility, source water quality, source water availability, and there's other factors that you can look at and can evaluate the risk associated with a given utility to identify whether or not it is actually failing or at risk of failing. So if we create this fund, I think we need to focus on using it to help those utilities identified as failing or at risk of failing. So I think that's going to be a big issue that we're looking at as part of the blueprint. Another major part of the blueprint that is also relates to something else, talking about the budget again. And I think what we need to do is talk about the Texas Water Development Board. This is the state's leading agency for our water and flood control planning. And they're also the state's bank when it comes to administering our water finance funds. I mean, the SWIFT and the state revolving funds, as well as the Economic Disadvantaged Areas Program. The Water Development Board is the little agency that can, and that agency's responsibilities have multiplied over the past decade, and rightfully so, because water and flood control are major issues to our state. So in addition to looking at pushing for our blueprint to address aging, deteriorating infrastructure, Texas 2036 strongly supports and will be fighting for full funding of what the Water Development Board is asking for in their legislative appropriations request. We need to set this agency up for success. They need staff capacity in order to develop their regional and state water plans and flood plans. They need staff capacity to administer the financial programs that they do for the service of their state. And of course, if the recommendations in Texas 2036 blueprint pass, they're going to need more staff capacity in order to conduct these assessments, to identify utilities that are either failing or at risk of failing, and to administer this fund. So I think, going back to your original question, Todd, I think the funding of the Water Development Board is going to be another major water issue for this session. With that being said, I hope it's not the only water issue. As I said, we have a significant opportunity here to renew our state's focus on aging and deteriorating infrastructure. And there may also be some other conversations about flood control and mitigation funding and state water supply funding.
So, of course, you just talked about the Water Development Board, and you've talked about flooding in terms of the research that John Nielsen Gammon, the state climatologist, did for you, and in some other regards, you were discussing flooding, and the Water Development Board now oversees a flood planning process. They've been doing regional water planning process, water supply planning for decades. But now they have, I guess, their first flood plan. Mm-hmm. And so they're doing more all the time, it seems like. I mean, I think the state's recognizing the need for coordination in these various areas. And so I would think that the resources are going to be needed to keep that going, especially if they're going to be doing more with infrastructure.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one thing that I find surprising, as I said, I was the Director of Government Relations for the Water Development Board in 2013. And this, even though the responsibilities of that agency have grown over the past decade, you have 3 full-time board members, you have the flood plan and the flood fund, not to mention the administration of the SWIFT, or even the new infusion of SRF dollars we get from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So even though the agency's responsibilities have multiplied over the past decade, the size of that agency really has not. And again, we want to set this agency to be set up for success. This is not an agency that you want to underfund or sell short in any way, because if we want to make sure we have the right flood infrastructure for our future, the water supplies we need for our future, and hopefully, legislature willing, a new focus on fixing our aging and deteriorating water and wastewater infrastructure, we need a water development board that has the staff and financial capacity to do it and to do it right.
All the folks coming to Texas and all the new industry, they're going to need reliable supply of water, for the 50-year horizon in the planning statute. And as that report this fall pointed out, if we're looking at 50 years from now and encountering another serious drought like the drought of record in the 50s, there's a potential for a really big loss in terms of the state encountering that kind of a situation again and not having the water that it needs.
Oh, that's true. And, one of the other water projects that Texas 2036 did was we partnered with the Baker Institute at Rice University to look at what the economic impacts to the state would be if we had another severe drought and we didn't build enough water supplies. This report was interesting because they actually drilled down on what the impacts would be on certain sectors, the manufacturing sector, the ag sector, and the semiconductor industry. And of course, it found when you look at certain industries and you look at certain regions, you're looking at billions in GDP losses, not to mention the upwards of hundreds of thousands of jobs lost if we don't build new water supplies. But Todd, you and I both know this is contingent upon a repeat of the drought of record of the 1950s. And you and I we co-authored an op-ed back in June, which it was wonderful working with you on this op-ed, that when you not only look at the state climatologist data and their report about future droughts being severe, but when you look at the historic droughts to before Texas was even a republic, you had these long, deep, scarring mega droughts in the 19th, 18th, and the 15th century that were worse than the drought of record.
Right. Our tree ring study that I did while I was at the Guadalupe Blanco River Authority with the University of Arkansas Tree Ring Lab. There's some droughts, way back when. It's kind of one of these, beyond the map, there be dragons.
Yes.
Kind of thing. The 50s drought was awful, but there have been some of the past that were longer and more severe. And so, it's like today, we're sitting here and it's a beautiful day, sun's out. You never know when you're in the beginning of another one of those droughts. It's just, you can't. That's something that you can never know, and you can't prepare for it after it starts. The real preparation has to have gone on for decades prior to that.
And I remember reading your article about the tree ring study when it came out. That was 10 years ago, right?
It was about 10.
And didn't you tell me that the trees that you used to conduct that study were swept away in the Wimberley floods? So
the oldest tree that we sampled in that study was a bald cypress tree, and it was they were all bald cypress trees, I should say, all over the South Texas. But the oldest one, we didn't get to the center, but we got back to 1426 on that tree. We think the center was close to like 1380 or something, but it was swept away in the Wimberley flood. And so, that's just one little data point that says, it's not really enough to be conclusive. But I looked at that and I thought, well, maybe that may be or is likely the worst flood that hit that stretch of the Blanco, since that tree was a sapling in 1380 or so.
Yeah, because there's no tree to have a tree ring.
Right, right. And so, that was an amazing flood. What it did was just shocking. But Texas, that's hey, there it is. There's the drought side and the flood side in Texas.
And I think that's, I remember reading the article, and it was fascinating when you look back to pre-recorded history in Texas, where you have like that severe mega drought of the early 1700s. And frankly, and I know we're going into deep nerd territory that's far removed from
it's a podcast. We can do that.
88th legislative session. This is why I'm interested in water. But even the late 16th century mega drought. There's an academic article which I do not recommend that anyone read right before bedtime, called "Mega Drought and Mega Death." Yeah. The last 3 paragraphs of it will literally keep you up all night. But I have on the subject of mega drought and mega death. Let's talk about the legislature.
Right. So anything else about the ledge you want to mention before we go on and talk a little bit about water markets?
Well, yeah, I think with regard to the ledge, I think this is going to be a water session because of the opportunities for funding water infrastructure. As I said, we have our blueprint. I think the critical need to fund the Water Development Board to set it up for success. But there's another interesting development that I think will make this a significant water session. Is last week there was the historic announcement of the creation of the Texas House Water Caucus.
Yeah.
And thanks to the leadership of Sarah Schlesinger at the Texas.Water Foundation, we now have a caucus that, as I understand it, it's going to focus on providing information, sharing data and background resources to members of that caucus. And it is sorely needed and exceptionally welcome to have this focus in the legislature on providing data and research and a pipeline of experts for members to learn more about water. And I think that is going to significantly inform the discussion that we're going to see not only in the 88th Texas legislature, but undoubtedly in future legislatures about water.
I thought that was a really interesting development too, and I wonder if they will have some joint legislation that the caucus drafts together, or how that might work.
My understanding, it's not going to be a caucus that, like a traditional political caucus, that will come up with bills and file them like you may see in Congress or even in some Texas legislative caucuses. This caucus's focus, as I understand it, is more centered on being a resource to provide information and education.
Gotcha.
Which is good. When I first started working in the House, I'd been working in the legislature since late last century with the Sunset Commission. And there's a significant stable of members that had deep water knowledge. You had Chairman Robert Puente, Bill Callegari, and some other members. And so I think the efforts of this Texas House Water Caucus are entirely commendable, because I think they're looking to rebuild that stable.
And I also have to say Sarah Schlesinger is another alumni of Texas.Water.
Wonderful.
One of the early ones, actually. So let's talk a little bit about water markets. And I have to say, for the record, that I am doing some research for Texas 2036 on water markets. What interests you in water markets?
Yeah, and Todd, we're very excited to partner with you on this water market study. And what interests us about water markets is, as I said, they have been widely discussed, but rarely developed in Texas. You could basically go to a water conference in any given year since 1999, and there would always be a panel on water markets. And you would even have interim hearings in the Texas House and the Senate on water markets. But even though everyone was talking time and time again about water markets this, water markets that, in truth, when we look at the water market situation in Texas right now, there really isn't a lot. What we've discovered is there are only 2 functioning water markets in the state. The first is in the Edwards-Aquifer area. The second is in the Rio Grande Valley. There are certainly water transactions that occur across the state, and this is good. But we're not seeing a lot of lot of activity in terms of like water markets across the state. I think they're important because water markets do several things. First, they encourage the voluntary transfer of water. Rather than having a governmental entity or the legislature command and control with regard to how water should be allocated, there's a certain grace and elegance to water markets insofar as you have like a willing seller and a willing buyer transacting and moving water accordingly. And so I think that's an ideal outcome. Another thing I like about water markets is that they assign a value to water. And this is something that's sorely missing from Texas. We've heard about this concept before, and you've had some good coffee house chats about the value of water. But Texas is a drought-prone state. We're subject to water scarcity. And looking towards the future, when we expect more groundwater depletion and more surface water sedimentation, our future water scarcity is going to get worse. And so we need to start assigning a value to water in order to more effectively use it. And markets do that, which is what we want to have happen. And lastly, I think what's a good thing about water markets is that they contribute to more efficient and more effective water use. And I'm very excited about the data that we're seeing from this study, especially the data from the Edwards, that supports some of these findings.
Yeah, we've got great data on the Edwards, and we have data on the Rio Grande, but the Rio Grande data, there's not as much available. We've got data on leases, but not going back as far as we might have liked. But sales data is lacking on the Rio Grande. But we have sales and leasing for the Edwards. And what I think is interesting that's coming out of the Edwards data, and maybe the Rio Grande data when we finish the analysis, is that like you say. When you assign a value to water, it really helps to change human behavior. And I think that's the key, is changing human behavior around water. And, I mean, you and I have been to so many conferences or listened to so many people talking about water where they, first thing they say is, oh, water's the next oil, or water's so valuable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, if you made a drinking game out of it, you wouldn't make it the next hour.
Right. And then the next thing, we're looking at all these figures about how much treated drinking water we dump on our lawns and stuff. And so, I mean, what that tells you is that, yes, people understand the need for it and that its value it is one that no one can live without. But at the same time, our system is not valuing it in a way that sends signals to people to change their behavior around it. And that's what I think water markets can do, and what I've seen in this study it doing in some places. And so how do you get from where we are now in other parts of the state to that situation?
And that is profoundly appealing. Precisely what you said. Using the market to send a signal to people about what the value is, and letting them make decisions with regard to how they can use their water. I think in Texas, when you think about it, that is such an attractive alternative to heavy-handed governmental mandates telling people what to do with their water. I think just the political ethos of the state is not one that really wants government. It's not one that's friendly to government telling people what to do, and I get that, and I appreciate that, and I think what I like about water markets is that it's a way to manage your water resources and apply stewardship of your water resources without heavy-handed government intervention all the time.
Well, I'm hoping to get all that wrapped up as soon as possible.
And we're really excited about this one, Todd, because I think I've seen some of the data that you have from the Edwards, and we can't go too far into that data, but these are some profoundly exciting findings that have never been seen before, that shine a bright light on the benefit of what water markets can provide.
Well, I'm going to have some wacky ideas too in there about how you get from here to there. So
I wouldn't call them entirely wacky just yet. So,
well, let's see. We've talked about all things water, what the legislature's up to, and what Texas 2036 is working on. What kind of getting ready to wrap up here a little bit. What do you think are the biggest challenges facing the state?
I'm glad it's a plural question. What's the biggest challenges? From the start, I think that the biggest challenge we're going to face is the future weather uncertainty. The one thing that keeps me awake at night is a prospect of a worse drought. I mean, a drought worse than the drought of record. We were Texas 2036 was successful last year during the Water Development Board Sunset Review in getting the Sunset Commission to approve our recommendation that regional water planning groups be allowed to use a drought worse than the drought of record for their planning purposes.
Right.
I think that's important because I future droughts are in all probability could be more severe than what we've seen before. And having endured 2011 like the rest of us, I mean, that was a miserable year. We were watching lakes and aquifers decline in real time. I mean, Lake Travis was going down, a foot a day? And then we were watching J17 with the Edwards also precipitously decline. And then it took us several years to pull out of 2011. Yeah. But I think the biggest challenge we have is making sure we have enough reliable water supplies for future worsening droughts. And this means we're going to have to do a lot more than building reservoirs and desal. We're going to need reservoirs and desal, but I think we're going to have to manage our water more effectively, like using markets. But we also need to pay closer attention to some of these other water management ideas like One Water and nature-based solutions. There's an incredible amount of merit to what's being proposed there. And I think the other biggest challenge facing Texas is the fact of the matter that our water and wastewater infrastructure is at risk of failing. We've seen catastrophic failures in 2022. And I suspect that when I rewrite my article on the top 10 Texas water headlines for 2023, I would be surprised if there's no headlines in there about major water system failures on par with what we saw in Jackson, Mississippi.
Could be. Mm-hmm. Could be. I wonder, even when you're talking about those needs, and you see what's going on in the big Colorado out west, and the 7 states that are dealing with that issue. I often wonder if people here are looking at that and thinking about, are we, in danger of experiencing something like that in the future? I wonder if that ever gets people here thinking about, hey, is my water supply secure the way, I hope it is for this, this industry that I work in, or a business I want to keep on growing here. And I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I was at a conference last week in Houston called the 10 Across Conference, where a bunch of states that transect, that I-10 corridor transects. So you had folks there from California, Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, Florida, and Mississippi. It was an interesting lot. There was a significant conversation about the western Colorado. Okay. And someone there said that, it's quite possible that Lake Mead is less than 2 years away from Deadpool.
Right.
Deadpool is a lot more than that really witty character with the two swords in the movie. Deadpool basically means you can't pump any water out of Lake Mead, and there's going to be no downstream deliveries. That Deadpool means you're not going to have water coming out of faucets in Phoenix and possibly further down the Colorado Basin. That is profound. And right. I think that could be. That could be, how that isn't being elevated to a potential crisis on par with some other major national crisis, like a major hurricane. I don't know yet.
Well, and not only are people in danger of not having water, but, it's a major energy producer.
Yeah.
And, energy producer of energy that is, not, putting CO2 in the atmosphere and all that. And so, so the impacts would be enormous, and certainly hope that that's not what happens. But, it's not looking good.
Yeah, I mean, the only upside of like these severe droughts is you get to close like a lot of cold case files. I mean, there's all these bodies that are showing up formally at the bottom of the lake. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, as I say, that's the only upside of severe drought.
That's the only thing that does is make me kind of afraid to go down the lakes now when they're trying to. So Texas 2036, again, how could we find out about your organization and what y'all doing with water in a whole bunch of areas?
Absolutely. There's several ways. I mean, of course, you could always follow us on Twitter at Texas 2036. That's our handle. Feel free to visit our webpage at Texas2036.com. And there's several resources on our webpage that may be interesting to your listeners, Todd. I mean, the first is our policy blog, where our policy advisors, like myself, write their takes on what the big issues are, either in the legislature or happening in the policy areas that they pay attention to. We also have a online newsletter that you can sign up for, and you can get updates for not only the work that I'm doing in water, but you can also get updates with regard to the work we're doing in other important areas such as workforce, healthcare, energy, transportation, and the state's budget. So I think those are the few ways I would recommend that you keep in touch and stay on top of what we're doing.
Great. And boy, it's been fun talking water.
This has been fun. It would be interesting to have a roundtable in a few months after this session to see what people think about what were the wins and what were the not so wins. Or
I think we might have to do that because we do that for the Texas Water Journal, and so that might be interesting to have everybody meet at a bar and tell their war stories from the session, or recount how they were victorious in getting certain things done. It would be interesting.
I think your recommendation of having the conversation at a bar would lend itself to a more animated conversation. I don't know if you have a beeper for it.
I don't.
Okay.
I don't. I had Perry Fowler got me at the end of one of these, and so no, it's kind of was it come as you are, or we go roll the punches.
Yeah, or everyone lets their hair down.
There you go.
Which in my case, I really can't.
But if you haven't, neither one of us do. Yeah. Okay, good deal. Well, hey, Jeremy, thank you for being on Talk+Water today.
Todd, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
So this has been Talk+Water, and my guest was Jeremy Mazur, the Senior Policy Advisor to Texas 2036, a nonprofit think tank. I also want to thank you, the listener, for spending your valuable time on this podcast. And finally, I want to give a big thank you to Anna Huff at the Meadows Center for Water and the Environment at Texas State University for getting each episode of Talk+Water ready to flow. How do you like that, ready to flow?
That is witty.
I'm just, free. I'm, just making out as I got here.
It comes for the pipeline just perfect.
My name is Todd Votteler. Let's talk water again soon.